Among the people who have influenced me the most, I count Jack and Elise Lerman. Both were members of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Evanston, Illinois, and as the associate rector there, I would see them almost every Sunday morning at the early service, which is not unlike our own 8 a.m. Eucharist. Elise and Jack were connected at the hip, going out on a date every Friday. They had met at the school of the Arts Institute of Chicago and were married for 61 years when Elise died in December 2018. Both were passionate artists, leading students of all ages into the fascinating and wonderfully profound world of visual art. What drew me to them was their willingness to engage and keep an open mind. We did not always agree, but we always learned from each other. Well, at least I learned from them. Even in retirement, they kept open hearts and open minds, always eager to discover more deeply the mystery of life and always curious about the God who did not stay far away, but in an act that could be described as an act of creating visual art, embraced our existence through the incarnation. No surprise that both their artwork often explored the human form and also religious motives. Jack and Elise deeply loved St. Matthew's, and that too was beautiful and inspiring. For them, church wasn't just about the encounter with God on an individual level. It was equally about encountering God in the community and taking their faith into the week. This is when church is at its best. And maybe in a similar way, this is when art is at its best too, creating a dynamic not just between the artist and the viewer of the art, but also among all the viewers too. On a more light-hearted note, I will never forget Elise's gentle eye-rolling whenever Jack would, as he often did, childlike, make a silly joke. Humor was very much part of these two saints. They were just beautiful, beautiful people. And yes, I do miss them. A few years before I left St. Matthew's to move to Vancouver, Jack offered Jane, our rector, to hang a few of his artwork as a permanent loan at St. Matthew's. They might not have been his best works, but they definitely made a huge difference to our experience of the building. The painting he hung in our main office particularly touched me. It was a depiction of the story from Genesis we heard read today. In a naive style, Jack had painted Jacob throwing himself onto the celestial being, and we do not quite know if they are fighting or if they are making love. Yes, there is a sensuality, almost a homoeroticism, that made me a bit uncomfortable at first, but that challenged me to rethink the story from Genesis 32. I really was drawn into what Jack had painted. One day I joked with Jack. I said, "Do you know how you will realize that I had fled the country? It is when that painting is missing." We both laughed. A few years later, as I was preparing to move from Evanston, Illinois to Vancouver, BC, Jack and Elise invited me to their house and gifted me the painting. I was leaving the country after all, Jack said. The painting has hung in a prominent place in my home ever since and is now watching over my private lounge at Ainsley Place. Here it is. The story of Jacob's encounter with God on the river Jabbok is a story full of archetypal motives, and it has followed me for a good part of my life. In fact, I consider it to be my favorite biblical story. Let me set a little bit of the context. Jacob and his family are traveling. He has been away from home for a long time after he tricked his twin brother Esau out of Esau's right as a firstborn. Now he wants to return to his kin, but fears the wrath of the brother, and not unjustifiably so. He is hesitant, reluctant, even fearful. And so he divides his camp, sends them on, and stays behind. Lots could be said about that already, but I want to focus today on the driving emotion in Jacob's heart at the time. I want to focus on his fear. Fear is a powerful, overwhelming, as well as a destructive force. Richard Holloway once said that fear is the greatest enemy to the gospel. And I suspect many of us have experienced or are experiencing right now the carnage fear can create in our own lives and in the life of others. The coronavirus pandemic is but one example that brings about fears, even existential fears. And as understandably as these fears might be, fear builds a wall between us and around us. It holds us captive in darkness, and no light seems to be able to infiltrate this darkness. Too often, then, we engage in irrational actions, lash out, and seek to feed our very own needs and desires without contemplating the common good and the good of the community. Jacob enters this darkness quite literally as the sun sets and night sets upon the land around the Jabbok. Yet despite the walls fear can erect around us and between us, God will not be stopped by these walls. God has a plan, and Jacob is very much part of that plan. And so, in the midst of his darkness, Jacob encounters God, thinking of him not just as a man, but thinking of him as a threat. And I wonder how many of us have or are now acting in similar ways to Jacob. Shackled by fear, we fight with man and with God. And yet, unlike man, God does not budge, does not flee, but holds on to Jacob, lets the fight happen, all through the night. And when that fight doesn't go anywhere, when both the man and Jacob are stuck because Jacob cannot move beyond or see beyond the walls of fear, God strikes him on his hip. It is a severe and painful blow, but it does not end the fight. Rather, Jacob throws all that he is and all that he has into that fight and onto God. There might still be walls around him that separate him from his family and from Esau, but that blow on the hip has torn down the wall between God and Jacob. And then the sun can rise, and Jacob can receive God's blessing. Genesis 32 gives us all permission to fight with God. Fighting God is not wrong. God is big enough to hear and engage our frustration, our anger, our fear. We do not need to hold back. In fact, we must not hold back anything. God can take it. He is big enough. In fact, he is even bigger. And the sun will only rise if we engage God with all that we are and all that we have. Yes, sometimes that means being wounded, being limited in our own desires and needs. This opens the possibility of receiving God's blessing so that we may become a blessing to our family, to our communities and neighbors, and to the world. And this is where Jack Lehman's painting is so significant, so profound for me. Yes, it still makes me nervous at times. I was wondering if I should share it with you. Would it be too much? Would some of you be offended by its sensuality, by its homoeroticism? Does that even have a place in the church? It is indeed an uncomfortable portrayal of Genesis 32. I do believe that this painting indeed has a place inside the church. And I'm not just saying this because of my own sexual orientation. I say this because I believe God wants us all to be intimately connected to Him, wants us to throw everything we are and everything we have onto God, whoever we are and whatever we might experience, our fears and frustrations as much as our joys and our sensuality. Every aspect of our lives deserves and needs to be held by God, who wants to touch us and embrace us completely in every fiber of our being. And then the sun will rise in our lives and in the lives of the world. And then we will receive a blessing so that we can become a blessing too.